The desert does not announce itself. It simply waits. Somewhere north of Las Vegas, past the last billboard, past the last gas station, past the last place where a phone still finds a signal, the land rises into a broken spine of mountains the color of dried blood and old bone. The sun is setting now, and the light does something cruel to this place. It stretches every shadow into a shape twice its size, and it turns every rock into something that might, for a half second, look like a man standing still. Listen. There is nothing here. No birds circling overhead. No insects humming in the brush. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, no footsteps but your own. Just wind, moving through stone corridors that have not changed in 10,000 years, whispering across a landscape that keeps every secret it has ever given. A trail cuts through the sagebrush and vanishes into the foothills. It was made by boots, once. Many boots, over many years. But today it is empty, and it stays empty for as far as the eye can follow it, until the trail itself disappears into shadow at the base of the mountains. Something is lying in the dirt just off the trail. A backpack. Old, sun-faded, half buried in loose rock, its straps splayed out like something that fell rather than something that was set down. Beside it, a water bottle, empty, its cap missing. A hiking pole, snapped clean in half. None of it looks abandoned in the way a campsite looks abandoned. It looks abandoned in the way a scene looks abandoned, the way a room looks after something happens in it that no one was meant to see. There are footprints here. Careful ones. The kind made by someone who knows how to walk in this terrain, who tests the ground before trusting it, who has done this 100 times before. They move steadily toward the mountains, toward the deep folds of stone where the light dies first. But if you follow them, if you kneel down and trace each print back the way it came, you will notice something the mind does not want to accept at first. The footprints only go one direction. One man walked into these mountains. No one has ever confirmed what happened after that. Before he vanished, this man told the internet a story almost too strange to be believed, about a cave shaped like the letter M, hidden somewhere in this exact range of stone, a cave that made his body vibrate with a fear he could never fully put into words. A cave that sent an experienced, fearless outdoorsman running for his life. And then, driven by doubt, by pride, by something none of us will ever be able to name for certain, he went back. To prove it was real. His camera recorded part of the journey. No one knows what happened after that. The desert kept the rest. This is the story of Kenny Veach, and the mountain that may have swallowed him whole. Before he was a mystery, Kenny Veach was simply a man who loved the desert more than almost anything else in his life. He was born in 1967, raised in Las Vegas, a city built entirely on artificial light, and yet Kenny spent as much of his adult life as he possibly could getting away from it, driving out past the neon and the traffic and the crowds, into the raw, punishing emptiness of the Mojave and the Great Basin. Friends who hiked with him describe a man who could walk for 9 hours without complaint, who carried his own water, his own food, his own risk, and asked for nothing from anyone. He wasn't chasing scenery. He was chasing something harder to name, the particular kind of aliveness that only comes from being somewhere genuinely, dangerously alone. On his YouTube channel, under the name Snake Betngi, Kenny documented pieces of that life. Not for fame, his videos rarely reached more than a few hundred views, but because the desert, to him, was worth recording. He filmed abandoned mining towns swallowed by sagebrush. He filmed mine shafts that dropped into total blackness. He filmed himself, at 47 years old, standing on ridgelines that most people would never willingly climb, narrating what he saw with the plain, unbothered confidence of someone who had made peace with how easily this landscape could kill him. He told viewers he had been doing this for over 20 years. He said he went where no one else went, and he never brought anyone with him. He said he had found skulls out there, animal, presumably, though he rarely specified. He said he liked rattlesnakes. He said the desert had traps in it, old ones, forgotten ones, the kind that could still catch an ankle after 70 years in the dirt. He was, by every account that exists, exactly what he claimed to be, an experienced solo hiker who was not easily rattled. There was another side to him too, one that rarely made it into the hiking footage. Those close to him describe a restless, inventive mind, A man who, in the year before he disappeared, had quit a steady job servicing coffee equipment to chase an idea of his own, a redesigned toilet paper holder he believed could actually go somewhere. He submitted it, hopeful and half-serious, to Shark Tank. He filled his house with the things the desert gave him: bones, old tools, the strange bric-a-brac of a man who found meaning in what other people walked past without noticing. He was, in other words, someone still reaching for something. Still building. Still curious about what came next. It is worth holding on to that image of him, because it is easy, once a story like this becomes public property, to reduce a person down to the shape of their disappearance. Kenny Veach was not a ghost story before November of 2014. He was a man with a girlfriend, a family, a channel with a few hundred loyal viewers, and 2 decades of desert behind him that had never once truly hurt him. Which is what makes what happened next so difficult to explain. In the summer of 2014, Kenny left a comment beneath a video with an almost irresistible title, a video about the son of a man who had once worked at Area 51, describing things his father had let slip while drunk. It was the kind of video that draws a certain audience: conspiracy theorists, desert wanderers, people who like to believe the government's most guarded secrets are buried just a few miles past the edge of a restricted fence line. Kenny's comment did not read like an attempt to compete with that story. It read like a confession. He described a hike near Nellis Air Force Base, a hike like dozens of others he'd taken, during which he stumbled onto something he had never encountered before. A cave. Not an ordinary cave. An opening in the rock shaped, unmistakably, like the letter M. He wrote that he always entered every cave he found. That was simply what he did. But this time, as he moved toward the entrance, his body began to vibrate. Not tremble. Not shake with nerves. Vibrate, a word he used deliberately, a word that suggested something physical happening to him rather than something merely felt. And the closer he got to the mouth of that cave, he said, the worse it became. Then, for the first time in over 20 years of solo desert exploration, Kenny Veach turned around and ran. He called it one of the strangest things that had ever happened to him. And then he went quiet about it. For a while, the comment simply sat there, buried beneath dozens of others, unremarkable in a corner of the internet built entirely on unverifiable stories. But stories like this one have a way of finding an audience that cannot let them go. People began replying. Some believed him instantly. His description was too specific, too physical, too strange to be an obvious fabrication. Others accused him outright of making it up for attention, of borrowing the aesthetic of paranormal folklore to inflate a small YouTube channel that had never gone anywhere. The skeptics wanted proof. Photographs. Coordinates. Video. And the believers wanted something else entirely. They wanted him to go back. This is the moment the story stops being a campfire tale and starts becoming something else. Because Kenny Veach did not need to return to that cave. No one was forcing him. No one could verify his story either way if he simply let it fade into forum history the way 10,000 similar stories fade every year. But he didn't let it fade. In October of 2014, Kenny drove back out toward the Sheep Range, the same rugged corridor of stone north of Las Vegas where he said he'd first found the M-shaped opening. He brought his camera this time. He wanted, it seems, to answer his critics the only way that would actually satisfy them, by finding the cave again, on film, and letting the footage speak for itself. What he found instead was 10 more hours of unforgiving terrain, and no cave. He wandered the mountains for the better part of a day, retracing routes, checking ridgelines, searching drainage after drainage for an opening that, on his first encounter, he'd said he found almost by accident. During this second trip, he reported something else strange, a black ram, watching him from high on a ridge, present for what felt like the entire hike. Whether it was one animal or several, whether it meant anything at all, no one can say. But Kenny mentioned it enough times that it stuck. He did not find the M-shaped cave. He uploaded the footage anyway, under the title M Cave Hike, and the reaction was immediate and unkind. Commenters accused him of lying outright. Some called the whole story a hoax designed to manufacture interest in a struggling channel. The pressure, instead of convincing Kenny to walk away from the story, seemed to do the opposite. He announced he would go back a third time. And this time, he said, he would bring a gun. It is worth pausing here, not to answer why, because no one can answer why with certainty, but simply to sit inside the strangeness of it. A man who had spent 20 years walking unarmed through some of the most dangerous, remote terrain in Nevada, a man who had handled rattlesnakes for entertainment, a man who described fear so rarely that when he finally described it, people didn't know what to do with the account. That same man was now preparing to walk back toward the one place that had ever made him run. What does an experienced outdoorsman fear enough to arm himself against? A person, an animal, a memory, or something he still could not put a name to, even months later. We will likely never know for certain. But we know what happened next. On November 10, 2014, Kenny Veach told his family he was heading out for a short overnight trip. Nothing about the message suggested urgency, or fear, or finality. It was the kind of thing he had said dozens of times before dozens of hikes that ended exactly as planned, with Kenny walking back to his car, dust on his boots, another piece of the desert filed away in his memory. He packed his gear. He chose his route. According to those who knew the terrain, reaching the general area near the abandoned mineshafts where he believed the M-shaped cave was hidden required roughly 10 hours of hiking round trip, through country with no maintained trail, no cell signal, no easy way out if something went wrong. It was terrain with a reputation that went beyond its physical danger, a place locals knew, uneasily, as a dumping ground, a place where things that were never meant to be found sometimes were. He drove his white Honda CR-V to the head of the trail. And then, according to every piece of evidence that has ever surfaced, he walked into the mountains alone. Notably, unlike his previous expedition, he did not bring his camera this time. The man who had documented nearly every meaningful hike of his adult life chose, for reasons that remain entirely unclear, not to record his third and final attempt to find the M cave. It is a detail that would later take on enormous weight, because without footage, without narration, without his own voice describing what he encountered, there would be no record of his final hours at all. He never returned to that car. The search began within days. Search and rescue volunteers from Clark County entered the sheep range with the same grim determination that defines every wilderness search, methodical, exhausting, and racing against a landscape that offers no mercy to anyone, living or lost. Helicopters passed low over ridgelines. Ground teams combed drainage after drainage, checking the mouths of old mine shafts, some of them collapsing, some of them plunging straight down into total darkness with no bottom visible from the surface. Friends joined the search. Family joined the search. People who had never met Kenny Veach, who knew him only from a handful of YouTube videos and one strange, viral comment, joined the search too, because by now, his story had left the forums and reached local news, and the phrase M Cave had become something larger than one man's private terror. It had become a mystery the public wanted solved. Every lead offered a flicker of hope before dissolving into nothing. A possible trail marking, followed for miles, leading only to more empty stone. A reported sighting, investigated and dismissed. The GPS data pulled from his last known movements, painstakingly cross-referenced against satellite terrain, mapping a route into some of the most inaccessible country in the entire range, and then simply stopping, as GPS trails do, without explanation, without warning. The sheep range is enormous. Its peaks climb toward 10,000 feet. Its canyons fold into each other for miles in every direction, riddled with abandoned mine workings dug decades earlier and never properly sealed. Searching it completely is, by every account from those who have tried, functionally impossible. You can spend a week walking through a single drainage and never see the bottom of it. For nearly 2 weeks, the search continued with no result at all. Then, on November 22nd, search and rescue volunteers found something. Kenny's cell phone. It was discovered near an old, extremely vertical mine opening, the same general area, notably, where Kenny had once stood on camera narrating information about the cave he was hunting for. For a moment, it seemed as though the search had finally found its answer. Here was proof he had reached the area. Here was a location, finally, that investigators could work with. But the phone raised more questions than it resolved. There was no sign of Kenny anywhere near it. The search and rescue commander overseeing the effort would later describe tracking Kenny's movement as far as that mineshaft, and then losing him completely. It did not mean, he was careful to clarify, that Kenny had gone down the shaft. It simply meant that the trail, for all practical purposes, ended there. Had he dropped the phone by accident, mid-hike, without realizing? Had he set it down deliberately? Was its location a clue to where he'd gone next, or a message, left behind on purpose, meant to be found? The footprints ended. The GPS stopped. The mountain stayed silent. No further physical evidence would ever be found. Not a bag. Not a bone. Not a single additional trace, despite years of continued searching by professionals, volunteers, and eventually an entire online community that refused to let the story die. To understand why this case has never let go of the public imagination, you have to understand that every theory anyone has ever proposed manages to explain part of what happened to Kenny Veach, and none of them explain all of it. Consider the simplest explanation first: an accident. This was, after all, punishing terrain, laced with unmarked mineshafts sunk decades earlier by prospectors who left no maps behind. A single misstep near the wrong opening in the ground could end a life in seconds, and the vertical shaft near where his phone was found is exactly the kind of hazard that has claimed hikers before. It would explain the sudden, total silence. It would not explain why he left his phone behind rather than carrying it, as he always had, to document exactly this kind of dangerous terrain. Consider heat and exhaustion. November temperatures in the Nevada high desert can still climb into dangerous territory during the day, and 10 hours of solo hiking through broken terrain, without another person to notice if something went wrong, leaves almost no margin for error. It would explain a slow, quiet collapse somewhere off the beaten path. It would not explain why, despite extensive aerial searches capable of spotting a downed hiker, nothing was ever found. Consider a navigation error. This was remote country without marked trails, and even experienced hikers occasionally misjudged distance, terrain, or their own remaining daylight. It would explain how he ended up somewhere search teams hadn't anticipated. It would not fully explain how a man with over 20 years of desert experience, a man who had navigated this exact range multiple times before, could become so profoundly, permanently lost. Consider the mineshafts themselves. The sheep range is scarred with old vertical openings, some of them barely visible until you are standing directly above them, dropping straight down into blackness for hundreds of feet. It would explain, chillingly, why searchers could walk directly past the place he vanished and see nothing at all. It would not explain why no shaft in the immediate search area, when investigated, ever produced any trace of him. Consider suicide, a theory that comes not from strangers online, but from the people who knew Kenny best. Kenny's girlfriend, who identified herself publicly after his disappearance, described a man who had quietly struggled with depression for years, a struggle that had worsened significantly in the months before he vanished. He had left his steady job roughly a year earlier to chase an invention he hoped might succeed on Shark Tank. It hadn't. Money had grown tight. According to her, Kenny had told her once, plainly, that if he ever decided to end his life, no one would ever find him, that he knew this landscape well enough, and it held enough hidden places, to disappear completely on purpose. She believed the missing camera was the clue that mattered most. Kenny documented almost everything. His decision not to bring it on his final hike, she argued, wasn't an oversight from a man planning to prove a story to the world. It was the choice of a man who had no intention of being followed, recorded, or found. This theory accounts for the missing camera. It accounts for the deliberate silence. It does not fully account for the specific location of the phone, deliberately or accidentally left near a landmark tied directly to the M cave story, nor does it explain why, if this was always where the story was heading, he spent months publicly, almost stubbornly, trying to prove the cave was real. And then there is the theory that refuses to disappear no matter how implausible it sounds when spoken aloud in daylight, that the M cave itself was real, and that Kenny found it again. No one who has attempted to verify Kenny's original story has ever succeeded. Amateur investigators, YouTubers, and experienced desert hikers have spent years combing this exact stretch of the sheep range using satellite imagery, archived GPS data, and frame-by-frame analysis of Kenny's own footage, trying to locate an opening shaped precisely like the letter M. None of them, as of this recording, have ever found it, or if they have never definitively proven it. Some point to the ranged proximity to restricted military airspace and speculate about sensor equipment, or classified installations disguised within the landscape, capable of producing a vibration no civilian instrument would be able to explain. Others point to something stranger still, the possibility that certain places in this desert simply do something to the people who find them, something science has not yet mapped or measured. None of it can be proven. None of it can be entirely dismissed either. That is, perhaps, the defining feature of this entire case. Every door investigators have opened has led to another locked door, and no one, not search and rescue, not law enforcement, not the family, not the thousands of strangers who have spent a decade trying to solve this from behind a keyboard, has ever found the key. In the years since Kenny's disappearance, this case has taken on a strange second life entirely separate from the man at its center. Online investigators pored over every frame of his surviving videos, freezing individual shots, comparing rock formations to satellite imagery, trying to reverse engineer his exact route from a handful of unremarkable establishing shots he likely never expected anyone to scrutinize this closely. Reddit threads dedicated to the M cave have run for years, generating theory after theory, contradiction after contradiction, new hikers announcing bold plans to finally locate the cave and then quietly going silent when their expeditions turned up nothing. At least one YouTuber managed to locate the specific mineshaft visible in Kenny's original M cave hike footage, the literal spot where Kenny once stood narrating to his camera, and retraced his likely path from there. Even this breakthrough, years in the making, did not produce the cave itself. The M-shaped entrance Kenny described has never been conclusively photographed by anyone but him, and Kenny, of course, is the one person who can no longer confirm where it was. There is something almost unbearable about this part of the story. An entire community has now spent more than a decade circling the exact same dead end that swallowed Kenny Veach, retracing his footsteps, studying his voice, memorizing the geography of his final videos frame by frame, and finding, at the end of every expedition, the same silence he must have found at the end of his. The obsession is not irrational. It is, in its own way, deeply human. When a mystery refuses to resolve, the mind does not simply let it go. It keeps searching, the way search and rescue kept searching, the way the internet keeps searching, long after the odds of finding an answer have quietly collapsed to almost nothing. Full-length documentaries have since been made about him. A dramatized film loosely based on his story has circulated online. A decade after he vanished, a true crime television program revisited the case for a national audience, interviewing those closest to him, walking viewers once again through a timeline that still refuses to add up cleanly no matter how many times it is retold. And still, beneath every retelling, the same unanswered question sits untouched. What, precisely, did Kenny Veach feel standing at the mouth of that cave, and was it enough to explain what came after? Expeditions continue even now. Small groups, sometimes solo hikers inspired by his story the same way he was once inspired by the tale of an Area 51 technician's drunken confession, still drive out to the sheep range with satellite coordinates and old screenshots of his footage, hoping to be the one who finally closes the loop. Almost all of them return with nothing more than sunburn and exhaustion. A few claim to have found terrain that resembles what he described. None have produced anything the wider community accepts as proof. Try, for a moment, to reconstruct what his final day may have looked like, not with invented details, not with imagined conversations, but with what we know for certain, stripped down to its barest, most human elements. Heat, even in November, rising off pale stone by mid-morning. The particular sound of boots on loose scree, a sound every solo hiker learns to trust because it is, for hours at a time, the only sound there is. A route chosen with the confidence of someone who had walked variations of it before. A pace steady enough to cover 10 hours of terrain and still make it back before dark, or so the plan likely went. Stone rising on either side, closing the sky into a narrower and narrower strip overhead the deeper the canyons cut into the range. A camera left behind, deliberately or not, a small, specific silence in a life defined, until that point, by the instinct to document. A phone, later found near a shaft that drops straight down into blackness, its final location a fact with no accompanying explanation. And then, nothing. Not a struggle. Not a message. Not a single additional footprint that anyone has ever been able to trace. One final hike. One final trail. One final disappearance into terrain that has never once given this story a body, a confession, or a conclusion of any kind. Kenny's family has lived with this uncertainty for more than a decade now, and there is no version of this story that treats that lightly. Some relatives have echoed his girlfriend's belief that his disappearance was intentional, a final act shaped by depression and financial strain that finally became unbearable. Others have offered starkly different accounts, including a claim, years later, that Kenny had in fact been seen again, alive, involved in an unrelated incident far from the desert that took him. That claim, like almost everything else in this case, has never been definitively confirmed or disproven. What remains constant, across every account, every theory, every online investigation that has tried and failed to close this case, is the absence at its center. No remains have ever been recovered. No conclusive evidence of what happened in his final hours has ever surfaced. The case remains formally open, a missing persons file that has never been allowed to become anything more definite than that. For a family, this kind of uncertainty carries a particular, grinding weight. There is no funeral that resolves it, no verdict that closes it, no single answer that lets anyone stop wondering. There is only the desert, holding whatever it is holding, indefinitely. There is something quietly devastating about a decade of birthdays passing with no candle to light for certain, no date to mark as the day it happened, because no one can say for certain that it happened at all. Grief without a body is not grief with an ending. It is grief that has to be carried indefinitely, renewed every time a new theory surfaces, every time a stranger online claims to have solved it, every time the case resurfaces on a television screen and a family is asked, once again, to relive the not knowing in front of an audience of millions. And still, the internet keeps circling back. New viewers discover his old videos every year, watch his voice narrate a landscape he will never walk through again, and leave comments beneath footage he never expected anyone outside a small circle of subscribers to see. Some call him a hero for chasing the truth even when it frightened him. Some call him a liar. Some simply write that they hope, somehow, impossibly, he is still out there. And so the mountains remain exactly as they were. Empty. Silent. Unmoved by any of it. Not by the search teams, not by the helicopters, not by the decade of amateur investigators who have walked these same canyons hoping to succeed where professionals could not. The wind still moves through them the same way it always has, indifferent to the story it is being asked to explain. Somewhere among this stone, there may be an answer. A cave shaped like the letter M. A vertical shaft that has never given up what it was hiding. A stretch of terrain no search, no satellite, no obsessive frame-by-frame analysis has ever fully mapped. Or perhaps there is only more silence, stretching on exactly as far as it always has. What we are left with, in the end, is not a solved case but a question about the nature of curiosity itself, about what drives a person to walk toward the one place that has already frightened them once, to risk everything not because they had to, but because not knowing had become unbearable. Kenny Veach spent 20 years finding places most people would never dare to look for. In the end, it may have been the desire to be believed, to prove that what he felt was real, that led him to the one place he never walked back out of. The trail still exists, technically. You could drive to that same trailhead today, park where his white Honda CR-V once sat, and start walking. Somewhere out past the first ridge, the marked path gives way to nothing but open country, the way it always has, the way it likely will for as long as this desert exists. The wind continues. The trail disappears into the dark. And somewhere beyond the last ridge anyone has ever mapped, the mystery of Kenny Veach, and whatever it was that made his body vibrate in the dark of an unremarkable cave in an unremarkable stretch of Nevada desert, remains exactly where the desert left it. Unfound. Unfinished. Unafraid, it seems, of ever being solved.